Good afternoon, everyone, and I'd like to call this hearing to order. Under the House rules, one of the responsibilities of this committee is the study and investigation of problems of all types of businesses, including those concerning tax issues. And today we're carrying out that duty, and we're very pleased to have Acting Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, Mr. Werfel, here to be with us. Small businesses are vital to job creation and innovation in the U.S. economy, accounting for over 60% of new net private sector jobs. And at the same time, these businesses have fewer resources than large firms to deal with an increasingly complex maze of tax laws and regulations. Over the past few years, the IRS has increased the number of small businesses that it audits. And this has been explained as a way for the IRS to close the tax gap, that is, the difference between what the IRS believes is owed and what taxpayers pay voluntarily on time. We certainly support taxpayers paying what is due, and most small business owners do pay their taxes. As the IRS taxpayer advocate has recommended, Congress should vastly simplify the tax code to increase tax compliance. In May, the Inspector General for Tax Administration issued a report that found that the IRS had used inappropriate criteria to target certain conservative organizations that sought nonprofit status. And since that time, congressional investigations have raised additional questions about the IRS's improper targeting, whether the IRS may have also improperly targeted the tax returns of small businesses for added scrutiny or audit. We must ensure that all taxpayers, including small businesses, are treated fairly. And in May, I sent a letter to Mr. Werfel requesting information about how the IRS selects and classifies small business taxpayers for closer review and audit, the number of small businesses it audits, and the cost, duration, and yield from all of those audits. Who decides which small businesses are selected? How's the criteria developed? When does it change? And last evening, after a month delay, I did receive a letter providing responses to some of those questions, and we hope to learn more about those answers today. As elected representatives, we must make sure that our government is accountable and restore the American people's faith in their leaders. And with that, I'll now yield to Ranking Member Velasquez for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. One of the focuses of this committee is to ensure small businesses are given the tools to comply with regulations without increasing their costs. No place is this more true than when it comes to taxes. In the past, small businesses have told us that complexity and uncertainty create difficulty when filing tax returns. Many business owners worry that one simple mistake can lead to a costly and timely audit. And at a time when many businesses are striving to expand, every hour and dollar counts. Small firms spend up to 66% more on tax compliance than the larger competitors and face constant changes to the tax code, creating further confusion and hindering job creation. They should not also have to face intense scrutiny from the IRS through business audits. Nevertheless, audits of small businesses, particularly pass-through companies, continue to rise. While the vast majority of small business taxpayers comply with tax laws, it seems they may be under increased scrutiny by the IRS, all because a few bad actors misreport their income. Seeing as our nation's fiscal constraints are an ongoing priority, I understand that closing the $450 billion tax gap is critical to our long-term prosperity, but so are small businesses. Any effort to increase tax compliance must be done in a way that is responsible, fair, and not unduly burdensome to small firms. I am grateful that the IRS Commissioner took time out of his schedule to testify before us today, but it is unfortunate we are turning a relevant topic into political theater. It is my hope we can move past the unsubstantiated belief that the IRS politically targets certain small firms and instead have a productive discussion to ensure small businesses are not unfairly harmed by overzealous auditing. Today's hearing will give us a better grasp of the amount and scope of small business audits. Since it is necessary to have an accurate picture of enforcement policies, I am looking forward to learning about the factors considered in deciding on an audit and about the average result. I believe this data is even more important right now as the agency seeks to be more efficient due to financial realities. We will also discuss whether the private costs and burdens of an audit are contemplated and thereby justified in light of potential revenue gains of an audit. This hearing also allows us to examine what is being done to minimize this burden for small entities. Small firms should be able to look to the IRS for help in answering questions quickly and accurately. For this reason, it is vitally important that we encourage better taxpayer service. The agency's move to increase staff levels in its Taxpayers Assistance Program is an important step in delivering these resources, and I am also pleased to see a greater emphasis on ACA education activities. With the proper tools, America's small firms can sustain the economic growth currently underway by investing in their operations without fear of an onerous audit. With that, I would like to thank Commissioner Werfel for being here today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. And our first witness, or obviously our only witness today, is Daniel Werfel, who is the Acting Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. Commissioner Werfel was appointed to lead the IRS in May of 2013, and prior to his appointment, he held several positions with the Office of Management and Budget, including Controller and the Department of Justice. Thank you for being here again, and look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Velasquez, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss tax matters affecting small businesses. The IRS takes seriously the need to provide excellent service to small business taxpayers. This service includes helping them understand and meet their tax obligations. Our assistance takes many forms. For example, to increase understanding of changes in tax law and in filing requirements, we sponsor meetings, symposiums, and seminars for small business owners and the tax practitioner community each year. We also provide virtual assistance through our website, irs.gov, which contains a section devoted to small businesses. It has a wealth of videos, audio presentations, and seminars on a wide range of tax topics. Even as we work to ensure that our service to small businesses meet high standards, the IRS must also carry out a rigorous enforcement program. In fiscal year 2012, the IRS audited approximately 1.65 million returns, of which 21% were small business returns. The 2012 small business audit rate equates to only 0.2% of all returns filed and 1.3% of all small business returns filed. In going about our work in the enforcement area, the IRS strives to ensure that taxpayers receive fair treatment. For instance, we recognize that individual taxpayers and businesses being audited may be dealing with financial hardships, and we have encouraged our employees to be flexible in these situations. One major example of our efforts in this regard is the Fresh Start initiative. Under Fresh Start, we have added flexibilities to our collection program in 2011 and 2012 to help taxpayers who are struggling financially. We are also focusing on reducing taxpayer burden through such efforts as simplifying forms and publications and streamlining policies and procedures. For example, in January of this year, we announced a simplified method for claiming the home office deduction. This new option will significantly reduce the paperwork and record-keeping burden associated with calculating the deduction. Ensuring fair treatment also involves making sure taxpayers, including small business owners, have recourse in tax disputes with the IRS. We are taking action to raise taxpayers' awareness of the tools at their disposal for resolving issues, such as the Taxpayer Advocate Service. We need to be sure taxpayers know how to engage the Taxpayer Advocate Service when they feel they are being treated inappropriately or encounter excessive bureaucratic obstacles. It is important to note that all of our initiatives for assisting taxpayers depend on the IRS receiving adequate funding. It is imperative that we have the ability to continue reaching out to small business owners to provide the help they may need in meeting their tax obligations. Since fiscal year 2010, the IRS has absorbed cuts in appropriated funding that total nearly $1 billion, or nearly 8%. This includes a reduction of $618 million as a result of sequestration this year. At the same time, we have made major strides in reducing costs and finding efficiencies in our operations. we estimate that we will have achieved $1 billion in budget savings and efficiencies between 2010 and 13. But additional significant cuts to the IRS budget have the potential to weaken our ability to deliver our service and enforcement programs, including those dedicated to assisting small business owners. Before I conclude, I want to briefly mention the work we have been doing over the past several weeks to chart a new path forward for the IRS, as these efforts are important to all taxpayers, including the small business community. We have initiated a robust action plan to address needed improvements that we believe will help restore and sustain the public's trust in the IRS. The report we released last month describes a number of important findings, aggressive actions, and next steps for the IRS. The problems with the 501c4 application process that were uncovered by the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration have created significant concerns for individuals and taxpayers, and it is incumbent upon us to take swift action to fix the problems that occurred. We are also reviewing the full range of IRS operations, processes, and practices to focus on how we deliver our mission today and how we can make improvements in the future. In that way, we will better understand organizational risks wherever they exist in the IRS. The IRS is committed to correcting the problems that have occurred and to continuing the important work of the agency on behalf of the taxpayers. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Velasquez, that concludes my statement. I would be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. You obviously don't have an easy job, that's for sure. First question, real easy. Has anyone in the IRS ever improperly targeted small businesses for additional scrutiny?
I'm not aware of improper targeting of small businesses. Let me explain the context of how I'm answering that question, because I think it's important. The TIGTA report that was released in May dealt in the area of 501c4 review. That's a particular part of the law where the political activities of the entity under the law are relevant to their application for benefit, in this case a tax-exempt status. So the IRS, it's incumbent because it's in the law. We have to do an evaluation. Now, that evaluation involves assessing the degree to which the entity is involved in political campaign intervention. And in this case, as the IG reported, the way in which that was carried out was done inappropriately. But shifting over to small businesses, as a general matter, throughout our small business, throughout the tax code and throughout our implementation efforts under the small business, it is rare or virtually non-existent that the political activity of an entity would be relevant in terms of any increased scrutiny that we would provide. So separating the two in terms of, is there a risk that that what was found in the IG report transfers over to small businesses? I have two responses to that. One is the risk of inappropriate political labels being used is extremely low because political activities are not relevant to the evaluation that we do. And second, as the report that we issued last month indicates, because the importance of the findings in the IG report and because of the public concern about those findings, which I think are very well justified, we are engaging in a process right now with each of our operating divisions, including our small business and self-employed division, to review the criteria by which small businesses or any taxpayers, but in this case small businesses, are selected for additional scrutiny, to do basically a fairness review. Are we doing it exactly right, or is there any evidence of any problems? We will surface them. So we're going through that review right now.
And again, I'm glad you're talking obviously to the folks below you, and that's what I'm worried about, is if you can be sure that they aren't, without your knowing it or whatever the case may be, that they aren't improperly targeting those small businesses.
I think one of the things we do is we have procedures in place for how a small business or other taxpayer may be selected for an exam, and we review those procedures on an ongoing basis, and we're going to do a special review as a result of what happened in the IG report, of those procedures and those protocols to make sure they're fair in design. They also have to be fair in implementation and effective in implementation, but that's part of it. It's about training. It's about making sure that the architecture of the protocols that we use to essentially select taxpayers for additional scrutiny is that architecture fair, reasonable, effective. and is it being carried out fair, reasonably, and effective? And we're dedicated to making sure, and I think the IG report is a helpful reminder in some ways to make sure how important it is that we're diligent about that in all areas of the IRS.
Well, and that's obviously what I'm very interested in too, is the process that takes place. And how you select, or what goes into that criteria on how you select small businesses for additional scrutiny. I know you can't tell us, what those triggers are, what those specific items are in a tax return, what triggers. But my question is, when a small business is identified for further scrutiny, or a tax return is kicked out, based on whatever trigger that is, well, what happens then? What's the next step in that?
So let me start with make sure that everyone on the committee understands that so much of the footprint of that work in terms of reviewing returns and selecting is automated and based on a computer application. And that's helpful in a certain regard, because to the extent you can take some of the human element out of it, you create a better sense of objectivity about how things may be selected. And so we have this process we call discriminant function, or in the halls of the IRS we call it DIF for short. And it basically establishes a set of scores that, based on the information that's on a return, just what's on its face, it basically gets us a risk score for potential noncompliance. And the key is, how do we structure and program the DIF for what returns may be selected? And that's informed based on ongoing research and analytics around where we have tended to see noncompliance over time. And critical to that is something called the National Research Program, which is a broader statistically based study of taxpayer compliance across the broad spectrum of the tax code. And based on those findings, which we get periodically, we learn, okay, this is an area that's growing the tax gap because we're having areas of noncompliance here. And then we can translate that into our computer program and say, if you see something similar, trend, pattern, behavior, then it should be flagged for potential audit or exam. That doesn't mean the taxpayer necessarily did something that was noncompliant, but we need some type of mechanism to make sure our resources are most effectively following where the risks may be. And that's the process. So once that's flagged, then it would go into our exam phase, and we would initiate a process. And it could be it could be either a field exam or a correspondence exam. And we have a great many number of more correspondence exams than field exams, because the correspondence exams are less burdensome on the taxpayer, less burdensome on the individual. And we've found over time that by sending a letter to a taxpayer, informing them of certain questions or flags we see in their tax return, that can be a very effective mechanism in terms of reconciling a difference that we want understood, rather than going through and sending a team of IRS people out to a particular location.
Well, sooner or later, there's a subjective component to that. I mean, somebody has to make a decision on whether or not that business is going to be audited or
Yep.
Further scrutiny. Who does that?
There's a process in place. You're right. It's a combination. We have structures in place that will enable us to target our resources to higher risk areas. And what we try to do is make sure that those structures are as objective as possible, based on substantive analytics, based on an automated review of returns, which is becoming much easier and more effective as e-file numbers increase. And so we're heading into we're in there, but we are really in a modern era now where we can get these tax return informations electronically. They come in and we can do automated reviews of them immediately. And where does the human element comes in? It comes in a couple of places. First of all, it's humans, it's IRS employees that are designing these protocols and programming the computer in terms of how it structures its risk. And then at some point, when you determine a problem and you start to see that you've interacted with the taxpayer and you're starting to see how the information is arising between the problem we think may exist and the taxpayer's reaction, then the human intervention comes in to make sure that we're managing this to a successful resolution. And to make sure the process has as much integrity as possible, there has to be a series of reviews and checks and balances to make sure that the technology that we're using is fairly structured and architected, and that the individuals carrying out on that technology are carrying out in a fair and effective way. And we have existing mechanisms in place to do those reviews. We have an Inspector General, as an example, who in this one case in 501c4 found a major problem. And now, obviously, we have a lot of cleanup to do and fixes to do in that area. But that also, as part of a check and balances, has led to us now reviewing all the various procedures that I just outlined. We're now doing special additional reviews to make sure that there's fairness in the entire life cycle.
Is there any other reason that you know of why a small business would be targeted, other than some of the things you just?
I really don't. I think if the program is working as designed and as intended, and I think there's always a risk of variation. There's always a combination of a mistake that could happen, and unfortunately, there has been cases within the IRS where someone acts inappropriately, and there's underlying malfeasance or misconduct. Those are rare, but they happen, and I'm not aware of any of that happening with respect to the selection of a small business. But what I'm suggesting is that we don't have any particular evidence at this time of that the objective and analytical criteria that we put in place to review small businesses for potential increased scrutiny has any fundamental flaw that would lead one to the conclusion that there was unfair targeting. I don't have any evidence of that, but the review that I've asked the new Chief Risk Officer at IRS to carry out, and by the way, that new Chief Risk Officer I hired away from the Government Accountability Office, and he was a leader within GAO and has a lot of knowledge and experience in terms of understanding risk and how to review these types of activities. He's the one who's leading this review. And my commitment has been to this committee and to other committees. We want to share the results of that review with Congress, because when I go back to that audit report that we've referenced, one of the concerns that I have in looking backwards at this and seeing what happened and dissecting it is that there wasn't enough sharing of information with appropriate committees as these risks were emerging. And so I want to change that dynamic within the IRS so that not only are we more systemically evaluating our risks on an ongoing basis, but as we're learning information, we're bringing it to the attention of the appropriate committees. Clearly, the review that we do within our small business and self-employment area is highly relevant to this committee, and I look forward to sharing the results of our reviews with you so you can kind of roll up your sleeves and help us make sure that we're doing things appropriately.
Who is it that's doing that review?
Well, we have again. I have a Chief Risk Officer named David Fisher, who he was my first hire when I arrived at IRS on May 22nd. Previously, IRS had not had a Chief Risk Officer position, and based on what I was perceiving coming into the job as this situation in IRS, I felt it needed a Chief Risk Officer. That individual is working with our various operating division heads. So in this case, for small business, he'll work with Ferris Fink and Ruth Perez, the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner for our small business operation.
Okay. Well, we'd like to continue to work with you on that process as it moves forward.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Warfield, the Taxpayers Advocate recently conducted her own study of small business audits, and that report identified geographies and industries where business owners are more likely to game the system. For instance, law compliance was correlated to taxpayers who have less trust in the government and belong to associations whose members had similar feelings. With that in mind, was there politically motivated targeting of small business through audits?
I do not believe, I certainly don't have any evidence of it. And I think part of the risk that created the problem with the IG report on 501c4 was that there was relevancy to the political activities that were going on, and that created additional risk. We have to operate within that risk because that's the law. In this case, we did not manage that risk effectively, and that's part of the findings. But to your point, to the extent, and that's why this is so important, to the extent that an individual or a small business or a large business has a lack of trust in the IRS, that does a lot of damage to our voluntary compliance tax system. So maintaining that trust is our bottom line. And right now we have some work to do, but I would point out that one of the jobs I have in building that trust is making sure that the public, this committee and other committees, understand the nature of the problem that we had in the tax-exempt organizations world and whether it was systemic throughout IRS. And as I've mentioned in my report, we don't have evidence that those types of issues with respect to the use of inappropriate political labels for screening is systemic throughout the IRS. There's no evidence of that, but we are doing extra due diligence to look at potential other areas just to make sure that we're answering taxpayer questions.
So let me ask you, does the IRS intend to use those findings as a blueprint for auditing specific types of businesses in certain locations around the country?
I don't think there's any, I would have to go back. I do not believe or have specific knowledge that some of the risk factors that would be placed into our audit selection programming would involve the type of criteria that you mentioned. Okay. I will go back, but I don't believe they do. I think it's more about we do research. We randomly select as part of a statistical study tax forms, and we look at them and we conduct audits of them, and we learn where there is underreporting. We learn where there is underreporting of income. We learn where there may be a lack of filing or something like that. And it could be things like confusion over how to fill out a schedule. There's a whole host of reasons why you might see a material difference between what should have been reported on a tax return and what's not.
Okay.
And we use that study. I do not believe we use kind of the feelings about the IRS in any way, shape, or form as a basis by which to audit.
Thank you. Commissioner, the most recent Enforcement and Service Results Report revealed that returns examined by the IRS of large firms has remained pretty steady over the last few years, even as more large corporate returns were filed. Yet audits of small businesses have increased even though fewer returns were filed. Can you please explain why more attention is given to smaller firms rather than larger companies, despite the fact that there was a reduction in the small corporate returns filed?
So I think it's something that we'll have to work with you on to understand those numbers, because as I understand those numbers, and Mr. Chairman, we responded to your letter, and I apologize for the delay in getting that response. But the statistics that we provided to this committee in that response show a relatively stable audit coverage rate for small businesses over the last few years. We are holding essentially steady that the audit footprint is roughly 1.4% of all small business returns and roughly 0.2%, and that's true from FY 10, 11, and 12. There's slight increases or decreases in the numbers, but from a macro standpoint, our audit footprint over small businesses has remained relatively constant. And so I'd want to learn more about the data and statistics that you're referring to that point to an increase. We don't have that same information. So
I just would like to see, some reconciliation between your numbers and this report.
Yeah, I think we need to work through that. I mean, the numbers and maybe the response that I provided to the chairman can be a first step in making sure that there's a consistent understanding of what the trend might be with respect to the audit coverage on small businesses. What I'm reporting to you now, based on the best information I have available, is that that audit coverage footprint has remained relatively constant between 10, 11, and 12. When you get
I guess you need to do a better job at putting that out there.
that could be true. We may need to publicize that to the extent we can certainly work with you on
Because
how best to
otherwise, you're going to
publicize
be
it.
hammered constantly. And the constant comments is that IRS go after small businesses because you need to close that gap. And
Yeah.
that is what is out there. That is the perception. And time and again, that's what people hear.
Understood.
As you may have already guessed, one of the most frequently asked questions from our nation's employers is how the employer mandate will affect their business. Unfortunately, we cannot adequately address their concerns because the final rules have yet to be released. Can you provide any information as to when we can expect the final rule on the employer mandate so that employers can get some certainty?
So at the employer mandate, let me comment on that. First of all, part of the challenge and approach on the Affordable Care Act implementation from the IRS's perspective, and I think from HHS's perspective, is to have a back and forth with the business community in terms of the impact of this legal requirement the ACA is going to have on them. So there's a lot of moving pieces with respect to our readiness for ACA implementation. We have systems that we need to deploy. We need to get our tax filing that are relevant to the ACA ready to go, and we're making good progress and are hitting all the milestones. But also employers have to get ready as well. And so we have an ongoing dialogue with them. And based on that ongoing dialogue regarding what the law requires, and based on that, what we think employers are going to need to do to meet the statutory mandate, they reached back to us and said, we have concerns about the start of this occurring in year one. And we made a judgment call, or the Treasury Department made a judgment call, that there was a need to have a transition period before those employer requirements would trigger. In terms of the regulations, there's a lot of different regulations, so I want to make sure that I'm answering which regulation you're asking for. But I can get you, I can do it now or I can do it later, but I can get you information in terms of what the exact schedule is on any given ACA regulation.
Mr. Rice.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Werfel, for being here today. What is your history with the IRS? Personally.
Okay, well, I'm a career civil servant. I joined the government in 1997, and I'm coming up on my 16-year anniversary in the government. My main interaction with the IRS prior to joining the IRS in my current capacity was I've spent a large part of my career on financial management, and in particular, the efforts to reduce fraud, error, and waste in the federal government. That was my prior position, which is a Senate-confirmed position of controller of OMB. That's one of the main things you do at OMB as the controller. You work on government-wide efforts to reduce fraud and error. So my main interaction with IRS was around things like EITC, improper payments, and things like that.
So in your last job,
yes,
you were managing a department or a bunch of people?
Yes, when I achieved my highest level within the Office of Management Budget, let's say as of May of this year, I was managing somewhere between 100 and 150 people. And
you achieved that in May of this year?
Well, no, I started January of 2012, I think, is when I started managing a larger footprint of people within OMB.
How many people work for the IRS?
Roughly 85,000. But I would point out, just based on your question, that one of the things about the position that I held within OMB is I had leadership responsibilities over the entire financial management community. I ran the day-to-day operations of the Chief Financial Officers Council and coordinated the activities of all CFO offices across government. And when you're doing things like implementing the Recovery Act or preparing for a potential government shutdown, the reality is the project management of that and the scope of what I was leading was large, much larger than just the OMB.
It seems to me, I don't know you. I've only met you today, and I've seen you in testimony and other things, but you seem to be a very forthright and competent guy. But, man, you have stepped into a big mess here. And I sure hope that you're a good manager, because they need a good manager. This entity is completely out of control as far as I can tell. You've had your past commissioner just resign. You've had 2 directors plead the fifth in the last month. You've had disclosures. You spent $50 million on conventions at some of the worst economic downturn in United States history in the last 80 years. And disclosures that the IRS can't even tell us what they spent because their accounting records aren't that good. And at a time when we're lambasting corporate executives for money they spend on conventions and denying their deductions and lambasting them for the mode of travel they take, and yet we're spending an average of $250,000 per convention at the IRS. So this entity is completely out of control as far as I can tell.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, just okay, go ahead and respond to that.
Well, I think one of the reflections that I have, having arrived at the IRS and coming up on my 2-month mark, is that it's complex. There's a mixture of
well, yeah, it's complex. How many employees?
There's a mixture. There's very, very effective managers and leaders within the IRS. There's a lot of results that I can point to at the IRS that are extremely commendable and impressive that we need to build on. To get the IRS, and I think it's worth noting,
my friend, when you've got 3 of your top people either resigning or pleading the fifth to avoid criminal prosecution in the last month, this thing is completely out of control. And some strong manager is going to have to go in there and grab control, or I don't know where we're headed with this thing. Let me ask you this. Do you think they're ready to add to their responsibilities significantly? Do you think they're ready to take on the administration of the Affordable Care Act?
I think what the IRS does is it carries out the laws that are passed, and it more often than not, in fact, at a great majority of the time, does so effectively. Then when we make a mistake, the mistake is very public and very significant, and we take it seriously.
Well,
we are going to be ready to implement the ACA. That I am convinced of, based on everything that I've seen in terms of the project plan, the schedule, the milestones we've hit.
Let me reclaim my limited time.
Yep.
As a tax lawyer and a CPA for 25 years, I can point to numerous examples where the IRS is absolutely unresponsive and incapable of handling the job that it already has. And then you add to this all these disclosures and confusions and scandals that have come out in the last 3 months. And I'm really, really concerned about the IRS doing its existing job, much less taking on further responsibilities. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Ms. Hahn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just was going to follow up on the Affordable Care Act question, and clearly, the IRS has a huge role to play. But I even think before this law is rolled out and implemented, I think you have a role to play in reaching out to Americans, particularly small businesses. I hold small business workshops in my congressional district out in Los Angeles all the time, and I've done several specifically on the Affordable Care Act, what it means to small businesses, and when the tax issue comes up, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of anxiety. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I'm happy to do my part to educate folks on the Affordable Care Act. But, it's not just negative, right? There are some tax credits that are going to be very valuable to small businesses as this is rolled out. What are you all doing to partner with HHS, Small Business Administration, to help educate and possibly diffuse some of these misconceptions and anxiety that's out there, particularly as it relates to small businesses? I don't see you out there yet.
Well, it's a good question. Certainly, let me distinguish between myself personally and the IRS team. But because I have, the reason why I say that is because I was in Atlanta last week, and I met. Not only did I go and visit with the wage and investment employees in the Atlanta campus and the Atlanta region, but I also had the opportunity to meet with members of the public. Members of the tax professional community, tax preparer community, university community. It was a diverse group. And one of the points that was raised to me, and it was raised in several different ways, was concerns about small business. And the reality is that in order for small businesses to maintain their competitive edge, to be sustainable in today's economy, they need an effective IRS that they can work with. And we didn't get perfect scores from the small businesses that I met with, but they are extremely appreciative of the important role that we play, and they're very concerned about, for example, our resources and the diminution of our resources and how that impacts their ability to do a bunch of things, not only contact someone at the IRS, but also the way in which we modernize our forms and our files, et cetera. So I've started that dialogue, and I'm finding it useful, and I think it's something useful that I can bring back to Congress, in particular the budget committees, and explain that significant cuts to the IRS budget, certainly they impact IRS, but they also impact small businesses within all of your jurisdictions. In terms of the small business division, they do a lot of outreach. I mean, I was very impressed with the number of symposiums and meetings, and whether they're done electronically or in person. And obviously, the Affordable Care Act is on everyone's mind right now because it's new and because it creates a different footprint of requirements. Their tax forms are going to start looking different in the coming years, and obviously there are implications for them. So we are definitively committed to having an open dialogue with small businesses and large businesses, for that matter, about their responsibilities under the ACA. And if there's other suggestions you have, but I think if I walked you through the series of symposiums and forums and meetings,
right,
you would find them overly impressive, but you'd also see that we're somewhat constrained by our resources in terms of how much we can do.
I got it, but I do think it's important, and I just haven't seen any of these out in the Los Angeles area. Let me just quickly follow up on one more question, and this is more and more small businesses are shifting their operations onto computer and internet platforms, from sales to accounting, invoices, inventory tracking, and other operations. So it's more important for the IRS's e-platforms to work well. I know again, sequestration has really, you guys have taken a big hit on that, and I know you face a lot of obstacles, but within the constraints that you have, what procedures are you considering to operate a more efficient tax administration system as it relates to our new emerging technologies?
Well, I'll tell you, I have a lot of budget meetings as the head of the IRS, and it's often about how are we going to apply a diminishing resource base to a growing set of responsibilities and requirements. And just to give you an example, there's a lot of concern out there from certain parts of our constituents in terms of the pace by which we're putting forms in an online way, because it makes their life much easier if they can do things in a digital environment versus a paper environment. But we have, resource constraints in terms of our ability to modernize those forms, and we have to make choices like, am I going to invest in modernizing this particular form, or am I going to have more people at the call center so that we can improve our overall service numbers? Or am I going to keep the taxpayer assistance centers open for a longer period of time so members of a local community can come in and get direct feedback on their tax questions? These are the types of issues that behind the scenes at the IRS we're grappling with. But to answer, one part of the answer that I wanted to provide you is we try to make really smart decisions about these trade-offs. So, for example, if we see a form that has a usage rate of 12% versus a form that has a usage rate of 78%, we're going to say, okay, well, let's not digitize the 12% one, even though there's a very loud community of concern if we don't. We're going to go with the 78% one. Those are the types of trade-offs we're making behind the scenes, but ultimately taxpayers are concerned because they're not getting the full complement of modernization and service that they're hoping for.
Thank you. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'd like to maybe rock and roll through a little bit of this. I'm chairing the subcommittee on health, so I get more calls from small business on the Obamacare than anything else. But I'd like to begin by just asking, and if you could be quick and direct, that would be good. Sure. Do you do your own tax return?
I do.
Good. A lot of people don't. When we get to the 50 workers, there's a lot of confusion. Is it 30 hours a week or 130 hours a month?
For the
we got to have the. Let me set
so
this
orient me back to, you're talking about the 50 FTE cutoff.
Sure. We have 12 buckets. We have to put it each month. We create a new bucket of whether or not, how many FTEs we had in January, February, March, April, May. Then we add them up, divide by 12, and see if that average is 50 or more. And a lot of companies, to set the stage, are very worried about weeks. Monday through Wednesday are in one month. Thursday through Sunday are in another month. Their payroll records are by week. So right now, there's 12 buckets. Each month you have to do the calculation. And people are doing it right now, because I should say the employer mandate has not been eliminated. The employer mandate is the law of this country, and it goes into effect January 1. And if people are going to comply, they have to be complying in about 5 months. You may not enforce the penalty, but that doesn't mean the law's been delayed. Right. Most of the companies I talk to they don't want to be law breakers. So you need to be able to define for them how they are not law breakers, whether or not you enforce the penalty. So for each bucket each month, is it 130 hours in the month as opposed, so if you worked 40 hours, 42, then 26 and 12, as long as it added up to less than 130?
Yeah, and I apologize. I'm not going to be able to speak specifically to the tech. I can certainly get you an answer to that question, but the underlying technicalities of how you would evaluate your status of having 50 FTE versus 49 FTE in terms of whether your responsibilities trigger for the employer responsibilities, that is something I'm going to have to get back to you on with more technicality. I just don't have that at my fingertips.
So the acting commissioner of the IRS doesn't know the rules today, which we're demanding small businesses adhere to, and they're lined up at my office, whether it's a donut shop or a franchise. They are desperately wanting to comply with a law that takes place January 1. The fact that you're not enforcing it until a year from January 1, it is still the law. And I'm certainly disappointed that you can't answer something. That is one of the most fundamental basic questions I had to ask. But let me keep going here.
Please.
If a company had a husband, a wife, and 3 kids under 26, so that's 5 full-time workers, is that one health plan they have to offer? Let's say they don't offer a health plan. Husband, wife, and 3 kids under the age of 26. Do they get penalized 5 times $2,000 or one family times $2,000?
I mean, again, we're going to start to devolve into a situation where there's going to be a lot more facts that are going to need to be asked. And I might not, I'm going to have particular subject matter expertise as the head of the IRS, but the head of the IRS is not going to be the one doing those calculations and providing that legal and technical advice. So it's just it's a question of how we use our resources effectively. And you can go through the tax code in great detail and catch me on a lot of things that I'm not going to know, especially being 2 months on the job. But my commitment here, what I'm saying here is the acting commissioner, and what I'm very committed to you is making sure that your constituents or you yourself have the answers to those questions. Because I have professionals at the IRS who are ready, willing, and able to make sure that those answers are as crystal clear as possible. That's the commitment I can make as the head of IRS.
What I'd like to do after this is give you a very detailed list.
Please.
These are the exact questions the owners of the donut shops and small, they're the exact questions they're asking because they want to comply with the law. They do not want to be law breakers. And it starts right now. I mean, here we are in July. This is the qualifying year. And today, the IRS can't tell them whether these employees qualify or not. How do you calculate a bonus? If I give someone a bonus, do I back that into so many hours because somebody has done well? W-2 wages, 9.5% of W-2. What about 401k deductions? Where do they enter in? These folks want to comply with the law. We can't get any answers out of your organization. So the fact that you're not going to enforce the penalty doesn't mean the law doesn't go into effect. And I know most people, if they're driving down the street and the speed limit's 45, they adhere to the speed limit. They don't go 100 miles an hour because somebody said the state police wasn't going to be there. So I'm very concerned because the clock's moving. Come January 1, that starts the next year. So I'd like to follow up with these questions, and hopefully in a very prompt manner you can get them back so I can answer the questions of my desperate small business owners. Thank you.
Ms. Meg?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Warfel for being here. The fiscal year 2014 IRS budget request provides for an increase of over 7% for taxpayer services. I understand better taxpayer service and education leads to higher compliance rates. Could you explain if and how this increase in taxpayer service will be used to assist our small business taxpayers?
Yes, certainly. I mean, the reality is we have, not to oversimplify, but to provide you kind of the basic frame, the way we think about it, two of our core basic missions are services and enforcement. And on the enforcement side, we have a very robust analytic frame that shows that for every dollar that we expend on enforcement activities, there's a very significant return on investment for that dollar. And so when we defund our enforcement activities, ultimately it means less receipts to the Federal Government, and that has real deficit impact. In terms of our service levels, we invest in a whole variety of different ways to make sure that we're serving our taxpayers, small businesses in particular. Those involve, for example, our phone banks. One of the main ways in which people get answers to the questions and get peace of mind and a sense of what they need to do and cut down on the amount of time that they have to spend trying to figure out what the tax code means is calling up an IRS individual and getting them on the phone and working through the issues. And what our budgets are intended to reflect is we aim to meet certain levels of service metrics. We have metrics for everything. And our levels of service metrics are down. They're down significantly because of the inability of us to fund individuals and hire up individuals and train them to be in our call centers to answer these questions. It also limits our ability to invest in web tools and other technologies so that a small business can say, well, I can either call, or now the IRS has this new format on the web that makes my life a lot easier. This is great. Let me go on and access it. And when we defund the IRS, we miss out on opportunities to help taxpayers navigate what I think we can all agree is a complex set of laws and regulations. And so when I'm sitting here or in other committees defending the President's budget, I'm not doing so because without strong analytics that tie these increases to both return on investments for the taxpayers so that more receipts come into the Federal Government as appropriate and we have a better situation, bottom line, on our deficit, and that we're financing and funding the right activities within the IRS to improve our service to small businesses, to families, to corporations, et cetera. And I think we could spend time, and I'm happy to do so, in terms of how the specifics of the President's 2014 budget, what that buys you in terms of improved service levels. But it's really about services and enforcement, and there's a modernization element to all of it, because as we improve services and enforcement, a lot of that is about investing in new technologies and make sure the IRS is along in the 21st century with other government entities and corporations.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Benevolio.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Warfel, did I pronounce that correctly?
You did.
Thank you very much for being here today. You said you had 85,000 employees in the IRS, plus or minus, roughly.
Yep, there's part-time employees, there's a contractor, but we usually rely on about 85,000 as a rough estimate.
One of the prerequisites for becoming an IRS agent, if I'm not mistaken, is you have to have a background in accounting. Is that correct?
I mean, I don't think it depends on what type of work you're going to do.
But pretty much accounting.
Accounting is an important part, yes.
Yeah, could you tell me again what you said earlier today during the introduction on the sequester?
Yes.
How it affected the IRS?
Yes, the sequester has, there's a, under the Budget Control Act, between the sequester and this something called the 0.2% rescission, it's about a little over $600 million. But just the sequester itself, $594 million reduction in our budget authority for this year as a result of the sequester.
And so how much is that in relation to your overall budget?
It took our budget from $11.9 billion down to $11.2 billion. These both the sequester and the rescission.
So what percentage would that be?
It's, in and around 8 or 9%.
8 or 9%. You'll see people in my district have been taking cuts of 15, 20%. In some cases now they have to work part-time. That's the only job they can get because, well, the employer mandate, you can only have so many hours and then they got to kick in a lot of money. Amazing. And you can't find 9% cut in the IRS budget when you're doing all these fancy conventions and videos.
We found the cuts. We're operating on that lower base. It's a question of making sure we're transparent about what we're giving up by operating at that lower base. And ultimately, if the powers that be decide we should operate at that lower base, that will happen. But I want to make sure that we're transparent with you and the American people about what trade-offs are involved in operating at that lower budget level.
And in regards to picking and choosing winners and losers, conservative groups, so on and so forth, you said, if I'm not mistaken, you don't believe that small businesses, or any business for that matter, is being singled out because of their political beliefs in any way, shape, or form.
What I'm suggesting is that other than the TIGDA report, which dealt with 501c4 applications, I have no other evidence at my disposal, and I don't want to speculate, but I have no other evidence of any of similar type of targeting of other entities. But I have asked my Chief Risk Officer to help coordinate a review across the IRS to look at that question so I can provide a more definitive answer.
In that review, would you employ, let's say, cross-referencing somebody who donated to a political campaign from an FEC report to whether or not their small business was audited?
Again, I would say if there's any types of flagging of a taxpayer for additional scrutiny that was based on political activity, I think that's something that we should be extremely concerned with.
What would fly up the red or raise the red flag? 10 to 1 for every, maybe 10 businesses because the employer or the owner of the business contributed to a campaign or was involved in some Tea Party group or something like that?
I think a single instance of inappropriate behavior by the IRS should be flagged and addressed.
A single
instance? We have situations in which we have employees that unfortunately at times, it's 85,000 people. So, we have TIGDA reports that demonstrate a situation of employee misconduct. A TIGDA can write an entire report and spend a lot of resources about one instance of employee misconduct. That's important to us not only to enforce accountability for that individual and to be transparent about it, but also to make sure there's no other systemic behavior going on similar to that particular issue of misconduct. So we care about every incident.
Okay, so you're going to check and cross-reference?
Well, what we're going to do, then you're getting into the feasibility about what we can do. And what we're going to do is a variety of different steps, including evaluating the architecture of our screeners, our filters, how things are flagged for additional scrutiny. We can evaluate that architecture. We can make sure that we're documenting it, updating it frequently, benchmarking it against other parts of the IRS and other ways of looking and doing checks and balances to make sure it's appropriate. There's a whole process that we can go through that I think reflect very strong management approaches in terms of how you mitigate risk and error in your operations. It's very difficult to eliminate risk and error, but I think high-functioning organizations work on very robust and sophisticated frameworks to understand their risks and errors and put in place compensating controls to mitigate them to appropriate levels. And that's what we're engaging with in the IRS right now.
Yeah. I see I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Barber.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to you and the ranking member for convening this important hearing, and thank you, Acting Commissioner, for being here. And I have to say thank you for taking on this really sweet opportunity you've been given. It's always good in my mind when someone is willing to step up in the middle of a crisis and say, I'm going to get I'm going to tackle it and try to get things done. And I really have to say, from what I've seen and heard today and what I've seen and heard you say in other hearings, I think you are very forthright, and I believe you're doing everything you can to restore public trust in the IRS. The citizens of this country have to trust their government. And what happened at the IRS, I think we would all agree, was egregious. The behavior undermined confidence and trust. It was wrong. It's been acknowledged that it was wrong, and I believe you're doing what you can to restore trust and good management. And I appreciate the fact that you've hired someone to take a look at risk, who will keep an eye on those things for you. I have a couple of questions, because I think it's been asked and answered, the questions related to targeting, and I'm not going to go over that same territory. But I have a couple of questions related to other matters that I think impact adversely or make things difficult for small businesses. For example, recent IG reports have indicated that there's a very high rate of IRS audits that lead to no significant increase in revenue. In fact, in the 2011, 62% of S-Corp's cases were closed with no recorded change in revenue. And yet these audits, as you can imagine, cost affected businesses a great deal of money and time. So what steps can you take in your position as acting commissioner to ensure that small businesses are not unnecessarily audited? I mean, there has to be a cost-benefit analysis here of the amount of investment we have in audits and the end result. With 62% cases closed without a recorded increase or change in revenue, seems to me that there might be some overreaching here. So could you respond to how you might take another look at this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you're going to evaluate your mechanisms to enforce compliance, you want to evaluate them across a series of different variables. One of the ones that we are obviously prioritizing right now is fairness and selection. And I think that's appropriate given the IG report raised significant questions, and it provides us and inspires us to want to look across the IRS and give taxpayers comfort that we're doing that review and sharing our findings and rooting out any potential areas of concern. But I think you also want to look at the effectiveness of your selection. And I mentioned earlier that we have ways of improving on a continuous basis our models for how we would select a taxpayer for audit. In a limited resource environment, this is very intuitive, in a limited resource environment, when you're trying to do your best and spend the taxpayer dollars as wisely as possible, you're going to try to target those dollars in a way that has the highest impact in terms of driving greater compliance. And if we see issues, whether it's identified by the Inspector General, the GAO, or internally we discover it, that audits that we're doing are not resulting in any change or any additional revenue collected, then that is relevant data in terms of updating how you're going to do your selection going forward. So it's a continuous model of trying to make sure that we are as focused as we can on the areas of noncompliance, because one of the goals here is to narrow the tax gap that we have. Because I think small businesses, they certainly don't want to be audited. They certainly don't want to be audited excessively. I completely understand that, and we support that. But I think they also want to make sure that everyone's playing on the same fair ground, and that if they're complying with the tax laws, which a vast majority of them are voluntarily without ever having gotten audited, they want to make sure that the IRS is doing our part to make sure the other small businesses are being compliant as well on a voluntary basis. And so I think there's mutual interest in making sure that our models for how we select taxpayers for audit are effective, sophisticated, fair. And so I think we're on the same page in terms of improving not just the fairness, but also the effectiveness of them. And those TIGTA reports are relevant as we go back and relook at those models.
Just a quick follow-up on that.
Yeah.
You talked about closing the tax gap, and I agree we need to do that. So other than auditing small businesses, which may produce limited results, what other measures can the IRS take to close the tax gap?
Well, I mean, it's in large measure around a combination of enforcement activities, and what we try to demonstrate each year as we're planning and showing Congress our budget and the American people our budget. These are the types of enforcement activities that we would engage in. We can do things like increase our efforts on identity theft. We can increase our computer sophistication when a return comes in terms of identifying a return that might have fraud in it or might have an overstatement of their or an understatement of their income leading to a higher refund than they were otherwise eligible for. But remember earlier when I was answering a particular question before, I said there's two arms to this. There's enforcement and services. And services are important as well because effectively serving our taxpayers does two key things. It helps them navigate the complex tax code more effectively and allows them to be compliant, but it also builds trust to the sense that they're having a positive experience, they're getting the answers they need from the IRS, we're helping them navigate. It inspires that type of voluntary compliance framework to work more effectively. So again, when we talk about our budget and the investments that we're making, my goal is to just make sure that there's a substantive discussion around the trade-offs that are involved at our different budget levels. I understand we're in a tight budget environment, and I understand that small businesses around the country are tightening their belts. We have to tighten ours. There are ways in which we are. It's a public dialogue about those trade-offs involved in our budget.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the additional time.
Mr. Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Werfel, for taking the time to be here. You commented in your oral testimony about being committed to good service, having knowledge of struggling taxpayers, and trying to be able to develop policies to be able to help them. And you certainly understand that the IRS is not viewed as warm and cuddly and caring, when it gets back to actually paying
I
those
understand
taxes.
that. I definitely understand that.
But you followed that up with needing adequate resources to be able to help those taxpayers. We actually calculated it out, even with sequestration, as a 5.8% reduction. Can you assure this committee, can you assure this Congress, and most importantly, can you assure the American people that you aren't going to have any more Star Wars parodies, that you aren't going to have any more line dances? And you'd noted that you'd gone through, in part of your previous life, in terms of looking out for waste, fraud, and abuse in government. What's being done to make sure that we really are spending those taxpayer dollars correctly?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I have a couple of responses. First, when I arrived at the IRS, what I found is that while there are incidences out there around things like videos and the expensive conference in Anaheim, and videos are okay, but we want to make sure that the videos are for the appropriate purpose and at the appropriate level of funding for those videos, because we use videos to train our employees. It helps us cut down on travel. There can be a lot of value to videos. But we have to eliminate our extraneous expenditures. And what I found is a lot of procedures were put in place before I arrived. The IG report that came out on the Anaheim conference, the videos that are garnering some attention were made, in some cases 2010, in some cases 2011. I'm not excusing them. I'm just saying, what has the IRS done since then, and where are we today? In July of 2013, what does our footprint look like? And we don't do conferences like we did in Anaheim anymore. That's a vestige of the past. We have new controls in place around video cost and content. Again, not excusing the prior activities, and there may be more that come out that occurred in 2010, 11, before these procedures were put in place. But what I can assure you is that strong, robust procedures have put in place to constrain both conference spending and any spending on extraneous costs on videos. I can't say we're at zero risk, but we're at a significantly lower risk than we were previously. And that's part of the trust building with the American people, is demonstrating how we're cutting our costs in those areas. There's very impressive results in
But the bottom line, I guess, and I know you can understand this, is what the American people's frustration, my frustration is, when we look at the IRS, just saying, hey, we're going to correct the problem, we're sorry it won't happen again, and they move on down the road. Do you apply those same standards to American taxpayers?
Again, I'm not, as I said, I'm not excusing the behavior. I'm just providing an explanation of what steps are taken when a problem occurs. We have there's varying different types of mistakes. And we can talk about mistakes from the IG report that led to a change in leadership at 5 positions within the IRS, from the commissioner down to the lowest senior executive within that managerial chain. They're all
maybe we ought to move maybe to the root of the problem, really. Because when we look at it, you noted with Mr. Collins, you do your own taxes. Do you do TurboTax, or do you do
I use
long form?
I don't want to give any favor to anybody. I use a provider.
You use
Yeah, I use a
provider.
software.
You use provider for that. Do you know how many small businesses fill out their own tax returns and send them? Is there any kind of data
I
on
think
that?
small businesses are roughly about 80% professional preparers. So I think it's
80%. How many pages are there in the tax code?
Oh gosh, I've
70,000
something
plus,
like that.
70,000
It's a
plus.
very high number.
If I call up the IRS today wanting to be able to pay my taxes, to be able to do it lawfully, will whoever answers that phone guarantee me that their answer is correct?
and that's not the way the process.
That's not the way the
works.
process works.
Yeah.
When we sign the tax return, so the IRS can't figure it out. The IRS can't guarantee us that they understand the policies that are in place, and yet we're trying to tell the American people you must obey the law. Doesn't this really call for legitimate tax reform to get a flatter, fairer, and simpler tax code, and to reduce the number of employees that you would need to manage just by making it sensible for the American people to work with?
I'll answer that question. I've been asked that question numerous times, and it's a very important and good question. Two things. One, as a general principle, the IRS administers whatever law Congress passes, and we rely on the Treasury Department to articulate the
That's not
administration's
completely true,
position.
though, is it? Simply from the standpoint, don't you issue rules and regulations that are not approved by Congress? It's your assumption that it meets the legislative directive?
Right.
But you don't come back and ask us if it meets the legislative directive.
Well, we get feedback if there's a concern about it, but the reality is we're I want to answer your
I'll tell you, as a
question.
member of Congress, a lot of the frustration really is we give the feedback and it falls on deaf ears. It's kind of the assumption we're going to be here longer than you are, and we're going to do it our own way. And that's the real frustration, I think, with a lot of the bureaucracies here in D.C.
That's the message you're getting. That is unfortunate. We want to partner with Congress. These are not easy issues. As you mentioned, the tax code is complex. Our responsibility at the IRS is to do what we can to carry out those complexities in the most efficient and effective mechanism. Very often we're successful. There are situations in which we're not. Those situations are normally publicized and raise significant concerns, and it's all valid. I think we have the same objective. Our collective objective is to provide a fair and efficient and effective tax system for the American people. From IRS's standpoint, we do deal with a lot of complexities. We want to partner with both the public and Congress and others in terms of how we can continuously improve. We have problems. I understand that. We are, whether it's the conferences or the IG report, what I'm here to say is not to excuse them. I'm here to provide transparency on the nature of the problem, what we're doing to try to fix it, how we're holding people accountable, and we can certainly talk about that, but how we're fixing it, and what are our future barriers right now? What barriers do we face right now to that goal of more effective tax administration? I just want to have a dialogue about that. And we're working on solutions at the IRS right now, and we want to work with you on those solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Far past time.
Ms. Chu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We know that small firms, especially those that are already complying with the tax laws, fear an audit as they are expensive and time-consuming. And I know that the average amount of time an employee spends on a correspondence audit in 2008 was 1.6 hours, while for a field exam it was 46.4 hours. So that's quite a difference. Does the IRS estimate the audit costs for taxpayers, and how will you ensure that increased audits don't unnecessarily burden compliant small businesses?
Well, we certainly track the duration of an audit. I don't know whether we have an information mechanism that can give us detailed costs on an audit. I mean, we'd want to be sensitive to the community in terms of not asking them for information that would increase their burden in terms of having them tracking their costs for complying with a particular audit. But I think the goal here is to achieve the right footprint. What's the optimal? The audit footprint that we maintain should have the right mixture of both correspondence and field. It should have the right mixture because the audits serve multiple purposes, right? They establish a base by which a voluntary compliance system is going to work more effectively because they deter bad behavior and incentivize good behavior. But they also, if they're driven effectively by the right risk algorithms and the right analytics, can really uncover a lot of money. And I think our revenue that we brought in from the IRS based on our enforcement activities exceeded $50 billion last year. So there's multiple benefits there, and I think the goal is to evaluate the various policy tensions that are involved in structuring those and making sure that we're making the appropriate adjustments, whether it's to Congressman Barber's question of making sure that if we're having fruitless audits, I mean, the shame of it would be if we didn't learn from those fruitless audits and incorporate into our process going forward. And so that's the goal. These are some of the guiding principles that the IRS has. And again, there's a lot of imperfections, but the objectives, I think, are the right objectives. And in many cases, we are successful.
Well, one of those big decisions for a small business is the classification of workers, and it continues to be a daunting decision for many small employers as to whether a worker is an employee or an independent contractor. As part of the Fresh Start initiative, which helps taxpayers and businesses address their tax responsibilities, the voluntary classification settlement program was introduced. Can you describe this program and also tell us how successful this settlement program has been, and what about the Fresh Start initiative as a whole?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, one of the messages we have is about the IRS looking to work with taxpayers in a way to help them navigate our system. But it's not just complying with every letter of the law. It's, are there changes that we can make and adjustments we can make to provide increased flexibility? So if something like they owe a debt to us and they're having trouble making up that debt, we have programs in place, like you mentioned, like the Fresh Start initiative, that can help kind of re-level set, understand the financial hardships that a particular taxpayer might be having right now, adjusting whether it's the payment schedule or the approach we take with that taxpayer. It's one of those things where, and there's also, as you mentioned, voluntary reports that taxpayers can come in and provide us if they think they have a concern with their taxes. We open up our doors for them to talk about. We create, to the best of our ability, a non-threatening environment for them to come in and go over those issues. And we work with them collaboratively on a path forward that makes sense, that gives them peace of mind, but also brings them closer into compliance. It's that type of work that I think is very critical. It demonstrates that the IRS is not in a place where if it's not, every I is not dotted and T is crossed exactly the way it's supposed to be, that some kind of hammer comes down. It's demonstrating that there are avenues that you can take with the IRS to work through issues. And in particular, if there's an entity or an individual with financial hardship, we have programs in place that have proven successful over the years in providing, whether it's a safe harbor or a new approach for taxpayers. They're very successful. They're very popular. I'm concerned about their sustainability based on budget. It's another one of those areas where I'd like to present a potential trade-off depending on our budget levels. But I think you're raising an important point about our programs and our ability to work with taxpayers in this way.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Commissioner.
Yes.
In some of the discussion you've had here today, you've talked about noncompliance and triggers, what sets off inquiries. I'd like to do something a little bit different in some of the questions. Let's paint a scenario and then see if you can help me work through it. I'm a small business, and all of a sudden I have a spike in business or a crash in my business or whatever it may be. So I have more money flowing into my bank accounts. Does the IRS, in their data collection, see that?
Likely no. I mean, we do not access private bank accounts. There could be we have third-party reports.
Okay,
that, like a 1099.
Okay,
so we might see a change in their interest income.
So you might see, depending on the model of the business, because most of what we would call small businesses are going to be pass-through type entities. So there might be K-1s or other types of partnerships or interlocking.
It depends on the nature of the changing circumstance of a particular entity. Depends on existing mechanisms we have. So, for example, we get 1099 forms that report to us, things like interest income and other things. So we might have insight, and that's all about trying to use third-party data sources.
You're heading already where I wish to go. I'm trying to understand what data accumulation the IRS collects to decide that I have a noncompliance, or I have something here I need to investigate, or I have someone here I need to send a letter of inquiry, or someone here I need to audit. How many layers of information collection are there out there? Are you collecting from private sources? Are you collecting through regulatory sources? How does the triggering mechanisms end up working to know, saying, this business, something different is happening, let's go investigate them?
Well, I would want to keep it general because, again, we don't, there are certain parts of our business operations that are confidential.
And that's a different discussion,
that's a
whether
different
they
discussion.
should be
But
confidential in a government.
The answer to your question, again, it's one that might not be able to be effectively answered in 2 minutes, but it varies. We might, someone might come in with information, a tip or something like that that we would use. That could be, but a large footprint of what happens is that the taxpayer will file their tax returns, and then we get information after that the filing is done through third-party sources.
Walk me through that information, because you spoke earlier that much of what happens is automated in the background. That sort of indemnifies bad acts from individuals. I'm now trying to understand what, not necessarily bad acts, but how much data accumulations happen.
I'll do my best.
And it's a fair question, because we all live in the databasing of America. But for you, does that databasing trigger when my constituents get audited?
Let me answer the best of my ability, and then I might want to bring in reinforcements to help me
Okay.
answer. You start with, and I'm going to make the assumption that the tax return is filed electronically. But even if it's not, it just takes a little bit more time as we process a paper return. But there's an upfront review of the tax return that's done.
That's automated.
It's most of it is automated. It picks up on math error. It picks up on different indicators of potential fraud or error. So that happens.
And then it's bounced against?
Well, then what happens is it's flagged for potential. We might not process the return immediately. If there's we think there's identity theft, we might hold it before we just all of a sudden process the refund.
Okay,
the different events would occur. That's based on a data entry. I'm just trying to give you a difference.
Yeah,
There's 2 points. There's data entry, and then there's later.
In my last 60 seconds, and I know this is really complicated. Let's go from the other side.
Yeah.
You have third-party vendors providing you data that all of a sudden this business has a much greater velocity of deposit withdrawals.
We can get that information does come in.
So it's not about what they filed, it's we're picking up something else over here.
Well, we'll run a comparison.
But does this set off a trigger to go look at their filing?
It could. In other words, what happens is once the filing is done, and we get all the 1099 or the third-party data in, we'll basically run kind of an aggregate comparison, and where we see material anomalies between what was reported on the tax return versus this other information that maybe dictates there was a materially higher revenue amount for a taxpayer than what was reported on their tax return, that could trigger, for example, a correspondence audit. They might get a letter, and they might say, we want you to look at this.
Well, just because I'm thinking about, as we go through certain business cycles, sometimes a business gets a contract, they may not be making a lot of profit on it, but that contract may have a lot of in and out through their bank accounts, through their vendors, through other mechanics.
Yep.
Does that trigger?
I don't know. It would depend on the circumstances. A very general matter, we would look for a material difference between what a 1099 is telling us about income going into a particular entity and what they reported on their tax form. If we see a material difference, we will flag it and we will ask the taxpayer about it, whether it's through a field exam or a correspondence exam. It will depend on the situation.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Chairman.
We have a series of 3 votes. Would you be able to stay?
Yeah, whatever you need.
Okay, we will recess briefly and come right back and start with Mr. Payne. When we get back, please get back as quickly as possible. We're recessed. We'll go ahead and bring the hearing back to order, and we'll start off with Mr. Luetkemeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Werfel, on May 22nd, we had Secretary Liu in front of us in the Financial Services Committee. And at that time, I brought up to him an issue that was of concern to me with regards to the activities of the department within your agency that oversaw that Ms. Lerner was in charge of. and oversaw the applications for our tax-exempt organizations. And in discussing those with him, he said he's going to meet with you that following afternoon, and with your new job, and give you directions on what he wanted to do and how, the situation you were in. And one of the things that I brought up to him at that meeting was that not only was it disclosed at that point, that the IRS was unfairly targeting conservative groups, not tax-exempt conservative groups, but they were also, but I wanted to make the point out to him that they were not enforcing the law against some liberal organizations. There was an instance that was brought up to me by a group within my state, some activities that were with regards to a particular group, and I spent 3 years working with Ms. Lerner to try and get an investigation of that group. Have submitted, myself and the group they're working with, submitted over 3,000 documents to her, and never received a single remark from her with regards to how the investigation was going, whether anything was done. And so Secretary Lew pledged to me that day that he would talk to you about that and have that investigated, that be in the report, the 30-day report that you submitted. I did not see in the report. Did he ask you to review that situation?
Well, I think one of the first things I would respond with is I have some restrictions in terms of what I can and can't talk about with respect to an individual taxpayer, because it seems that your question orients around an individual taxpayer. And delving into the specifics of the situation with that taxpayer would require a 6103 waiver or something like that. So I apologize. I don't know the answer to your question unless I can get more specifics.
My question is, did he ask you to investigate that situation?
He asked me, well, this is a good way of answering it. He asked me to broadly review a variety of different activities within the IRS to ensure fair enforcement. With respect to a particular activity, I don't have a recollection of him raising a particular taxpayer or a particular issue, but I have to go back and consult.
Well, one of the concerns I have is that your report, the report that you did over a 30-day period, does not indicate any sort of investigation or oversight or even a mention of looking at the fact that there may have been a lack of enforcement by the IRS with regards to other organizations. So it would lead me to believe that there wasn't a follow-up, or he didn't ask the question correctly.
Let me respond in a couple of different ways. First of all, the 30-day report is a point in time. More work is needed, and there's more evaluation that's underway. So to the extent that there's some topic or area that is not as robustly covered in the report that should be based on input from this committee and others, that's something that we're open to. That report was intended to set up a dialogue. Secondly, I'd have to re-engage with Mr. Lew to kind of remind ourselves of conversations we had 2 months ago. But as a general matter, because the issue involves a specific taxpayer, I may not be able to cover it in a public report. It may be something that I need to deal with, and unless you have a waiver from that taxpayer, it may be something that I can't even articulate in specifics with you, just based on what the law is, not because I don't want to help.
Will you pledge to me today to investigate those folks if I send you a request?
I will pledge to certainly look into it.
And respond in a timely fashion?
I will respond to the extent I can, permitted by law, yes.
Okay.
But again, what my suggestion may be that it may be appropriate for the taxpayer to provide a waiver so that I can talk directly about the situation with a particular taxpayer to you, which is done. This is not an...
Well, they're not going to do that because they're of a different political ilk, and so they're not going to be willing to do that. That's the problem, is that they're being very punitive in the way they go about their activities. They're a direct violation of something you said a while ago, to the degree in which they're engaged in political activities that are absolutely in violation of their 501c3, I believe.
Let me make one point, since you raised the question, if I could, and that is one of the things that was in my 30-day report, but as circumstances evolve, it merits more discussion and attention, and I think this has been publicly reported, but the facts in this case, as we review more documents and talk to more people, is that there's a diversity across the political spectrum of entities that were, for example, included on these lookout lists that were screened for additional scrutiny. And so the reason why I'm raising it is just kind of in response to the question of, to the extent there was activity by the IRS that leaned in one way aggressive scrutiny towards one end of the political spectrum, and another way less aggressive scrutiny. As the facts and circumstances emerge in this case, I just want to make sure it's clear that there's a diversity across the political spectrum of entities that had issues that are covered by that TIGDA report.
But the point I'm trying to make, Mr. Werfel, is this. Ms. Lerner had a political bent. She obviously was trying to be punitive in the way she looked at the conservative groups. I'm saying that there's another side to this that nobody's thought about, nobody's investigated, nobody's said anything about, and that is the fact that she did not enforce the law on the other side of the political spectrum and let them get away with stuff that did not provide fair treatment to all parties who were involved in this 501c3 exemption. That's the point I'm trying to make, is there needs to be a realization and an acknowledgement of the fact that she, as a member of this organization, refused to investigate it, and that has to be investigated.
I'm not aware of evidence that would support your conclusion.
It's in the file. IRS has got it, over 3,000 pages of documents. If you want to send it again, be glad to do it.
I'm telling you, I'm not aware of the evidence that would support.
Are you willing to look into it then?
Yes. I mean, one of my main objectives is to look into this entire situation.
Okay. I'm aware over time I'll yield back, but I think there's an important question that also needs to be asked today by somebody, and is this, do you share your databases with anybody?
We, under the law, we have certain legal responsibilities to share our data. For example, for the administration of tax purposes, yes, we share our data, but we do so in a way that has an enormous number of safeguards.
Could you share a list with the committee of all the agencies, all the departments across government that you share your list with, and if anybody on the private sector, any third parties get access to that information?
I can give you a head start on your answer too, which is if you go to Section 6103, there's a particular set of exceptions that dictate when the IRS can share information outside
Will
of the
you be
IRS.
willing, Mr. Werfel, to give us a list
Yes.
of every agency in state government and all the third-party contractors you have that collect data that you have access to and that you have data sharing agreements with?
We will do our best to provide you a comprehensive list.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Holzkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate, Mr. Commissioner, for you being here today, and I'd like to cover a couple things that we've briefly discussed previously, and I want to know, under what specific statutory authority was the employer mandate penalty delayed?
I don't have the details on the legal analysis. The role of the IRS in that decision was to be consulted on the operational implications of this transitional relief period that the Treasury Department announced early in July.
And did the White House visit with you directly about that period?
No.
And so how did you find out about it?
It was a combination of two factors. One, the first step was that Treasury engaged IRS staff and consulted them on the administrative implications of a transitional relief period. And then I, in a subsequent meeting with the Treasury Department, learned that they were considering it. And again, the IRS footprint in this is, what are the administrative implications?
In the follow-up to that, in the proposal, you talk about voluntarily complying. Obviously, the penalty has been suspended. The 4 in 2014 has been changed to 2015, but will there be any implications, particularly for small businesses, if they do not voluntarily comply?
No. And again, the definition of small business is one that we have to make sure that we're clear on, because if you have more than 50 FTE, then you have these employer reporting requirements and particular responsibilities. If you have smaller than 50 FTE, the situation for you as an employer is very different. But there will be no penalty we encourage voluntary reporting, but no penalty for not reporting and no responsibility payment in the first year.
Will there be any implications in terms of your algorithms and in terms of selection for audit if folks do not voluntarily comply? You can guarantee that will not be part of the
No,
algorithm.
I will talk to the team about it and make sure, but there's no intent to do that at all.
Well, speaking of determining who receives an audit, a few weeks ago it was noted that approximately 24,000 refunds were sent to one address in Atlanta.
Yes, I'm aware of this.
How exactly does your algorithm ignore addresses? That doesn't show up. You don't compare addresses. That isn't in the algorithm to determine whether or not we have some fraud going on?
I think it's a very important question. And what happened there, I think there was illegally obtained taxpayer identification numbers, and the way in which this individual or entity sought to defraud the government, they were able to orient those in a way that we didn't pick up on it as quickly as we should have. We're learning from that experience, but I agree.
Do you know how they missed it? I mean, this is not just, that's the one big instance. There are 154 different addresses that receive more than 1,000 refunds to those addresses. So you don't take the address in to account at all in the algorithm in determining who to audit?
I think we do, but I have to get back to you to answer the question in why this particular fraud scheme eluded us.
And these folks that put this algorithm together or investigating that, are they the same folks that will put together the Obamacare reporting system that will be implemented, obviously, for individuals beginning January 1st?
Not exactly, but there will be some overlap between the work that's done in terms of our enforcement of ACA and those that would look at individuals. It depends on the nature of the ACA enforcement, but there will be some overlap. Yes, if it's because the way it works in the IRS is, if we set up by wage and investment deals with individuals, small businesses deal with small businesses. So I'd have to go back and understand exactly how that Atlanta-based scheme played out and who was involved. But there could be some overlap, yes.
Well, again, it wasn't just Atlanta. There was 153 other addresses, and I want to make sure that we're clear on the IG report. And I have some very specific, a couple regulations that are very detrimental to small businesses. One is regulation of the IRS that will require businesses with non-audited financial statements to evaluate each and every expense over $100 to determine whether that item must be depreciated. That will kick in on January 1st. And the second one would require that any small business spending more than $100 to repair any building's unit of property subject every single expenditure over $100 up to 9 different tests to determine if the amount spent is an improvement. Now, that is a mouthful. I mean, that's your mouthful, not mine. But as an absolutely ridiculous example, if a small business owner, for example, would replace a toilet in a building at the cost of $400 under this guidance, they will be forced to depreciate that toilet over 39 years for a net deduction of $10 every year. Now, there's a couple very specific regulations coming in January 1st impacting small businesses. Can you explain the rationale behind these?
No, what you described sounds nonsensical. I'd like to look into it.
Okay. Can you provide a written response to the committee? Again, I believe one of these, perhaps both of them, were delayed for a year. And again, there's no specific, I don't believe, statutory authority, which is much different than the Obamacare penalty delay. But this is coming January 1st. I'm hearing this from small businesses, and it's an absolute paperwork nightmare. And I appreciate a very quick response because they're preparing for that. We're already obviously into the month of July, and they have to start gathering this information prepared for next January 1st.
I appreciate you raising the concern.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Mulvaney.
Thank you, Mr. Werfel. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about the revelations that came out of Senator Grassley's office in the last couple of days.
Yes.
Do you know the donors or candidates whose information was supposedly improperly scrutinized?
I talked to my staff and I think my staff spoke to the Inspector General's shop, so we were able to learn that information.
Do you intend to tell those folks that their information was inappropriate?
I think that's consistent with the appropriate process.
Have you all figured out yet? I think there's a report today saying that there were several instances where the disclosure may have been inadvertent, one where it was intentional, and that was conducted by a person who was not a member of your agency.
We've been able to confirm that the one willful unauthorized disclosure did not occur within the IRS.
How is it possible that somebody who is not within the IRS had access to that information to begin with?
It's a good question. As I mentioned earlier, there are legal frameworks, programs, and policies in place in which the IRS will share taxpayer information with other federal agencies and with state agencies. In particular, for example, for the implementation of Medicaid. These are the way the programs work. We set up safeguards and to ensure that those informations are not.
So you don't think
breached.
it was a hacker? You think it was somebody who was, without telling me who it was, because I don't want to know who it was, because that's an ongoing investigation.
That's
I take
right.
it. It's somebody that was properly given the information. They improperly shared it beyond that.
It could be one of a number of things, but it may be that you have, let's say, hypothetically, an individual in a state revenue office who did not have a need to know the information, but accessed it anyway. Something like that is what we're talking about.
In the cases where that was inadvertently scrutinized, do you know which members of your agency participated in that?
I don't have the full details yet, but in any case in which the IG reports that situation to us, we look into it and we make sure that we're taking the appropriate procedures to make sure that such an inadvertent disclosure doesn't happen again.
Switch with me for a second to your Internet email policy. According to the 2009 IRS Employee Handbook, your agency says the Fourth Amendment does not protect emails because Internet users don't have, quote, a reasonable expectation of privacy in such communications. Especially in light of the fact that your agency is going to be overseeing or implementing large portions of Obamacare, is it still the position of the IRS that it has the right to search, collect, and review Internet or email data without a search warrant?
I think there's a Supreme Court decision on this.
It's a Sixth Circuit case. It's not a Supreme Court case.
Okay. I would have to consult because I'm not exactly sure.
Would you mind letting us know and writing us what the policy is?
I will.
Thank you very much. If a small business owner who also happens to be either a participant in a conservative group or a donor to a conservative group or a donor to a conservative candidate has been audited in the last, say, 48 months, and they are naturally suspicious as to whether or not they have been targeted improperly, what is the appropriate steps for them to take to answer that question to their satisfaction?
I would offer two, and several are taking these steps. One, if they believe it was inappropriate, they can refer the matter to the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, and I believe TIGTA is receiving those and doing the appropriate investigations. Or they can go to the National Taxpayer Advocate and raise the issue. Now, the National Taxpayer Advocate is more aligned to, not that I necessarily feel I was treated inappropriately, but I'm having trouble with the bureaucracy. So it really depends on the circumstance. But if the taxpayer believes that there was really wrongful conduct going on, they should refer the matter to the IG. If I find such an issue, I certainly would refer it to the IG and have them do the appropriate investigation.
So if a large donor to Mr. Hulskamp, for example, was audited for the first time in his history and is concerned that he's been targeted, you think the appropriate step is to call the Inspector General?
If the person has a basis to believe that there was something inappropriate going on, but just based on the fact pattern that you provided, I would
How would they know?
It would be very difficult for the IRS to know.
How would they know if there's a basis?
Well, it's a good question, but I would articulate. I mean, I think out of an abundance of caution, if they felt that they were being mistreated by the IRS, they should raise the issue. But I would also articulate that I'm not sure how the IRS would have that information in order how to influence the audit footprint.
Are you all worried and have talked about the potential, any potential legal liability that you may have to folks that have been targeted?
We have several lawsuits pending as a result of the IG report that was issued in mid-May.
Have you budgeted for any losses related to those lawsuits?
Well, the budgeting process around litigation loss in the government is somewhat complicated. There are judgment funds that are reserve funds that pay out for those things. So the answer to your question is I'd have to go back and look at how we're dealing with our litigation exposure. This would not be the first time we are under litigation, and we have certain budgetary procedures in place.
That makes sense. And finally, and I appreciate the extra time, Mr. Chairman, I was a little bit surprised because, again, I'd never worked for the government. When Mrs. Lerner was asked to resign several weeks ago, she declined, and then she was placed on administrative leave, I believe, with pay. Okay? This is something that is completely foreign to those of us who came up in the private sector. Why wasn't she fired?
So if I could, can I lift up the discussion because
Sure.
the Privacy Act.
Better than dragging it down. Yeah,
Well,
go ahead.
that's true. I have to lift up to more generalities because the Privacy Act would preclude me from commenting on a particular employee's status with respect to a disciplinary action.
Understood.
But let me say this, and it's a good question, and I'm glad you raised it. When there are very specific laws and regulations in place that govern civil servant employment, how you hire them, how you pay them, how you potentially separate from the government from them, whether it's retirement, buyout, or a disciplinary action, leave. And what we do in the IRS and what I'm making sure that we do is, to the extent appropriate, we'll take the most aggressive possible action we can where we believe an individual can no longer hold a position of trust within this agency. And that's generally the steps we take. Now, there is a process, a due process that goes on, and it was built to protect Federal employees for a whole variety of different reasons, and there's probably a good, valid public policy debate we could have on those rules, where if you have concerns that an individual can no longer hold a position of public trust within the government, the first step in that process is to place them on leave. It's paid leave while you build the record and give them a chance to respond to that record about what the ultimate disposition of their employment should be. And so it's just the rules and regulations are just set up that you default while that discovery is being done and while that due process is being done, that the individual is paid. It would be a violation of the law for me in the situation where I felt that an individual could no longer hold a position of public trust to move to immediate termination. There are circumstances where you can do it, but it has to do with kind of criminal violations.
Just to wrap up and trying to bring it back to Ms. Lerner, is that due process still ongoing, or have you all made a determination as to whether or not she's able to stay with the organization within a position of trust?
I can't comment on that particular situation. I will say that as a
You can tell me if it's still ongoing or finished, can't you? Without telling me any of the
I can
details.
tell you in a setting that's not public. I can share that information.
Is she
with you in a
still
setting that's
employed by
not
the
public.
IRS? You can tell me that.
Yes, she's still employed by the
Thank
IRS.
you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the additional time.
Thank you very much. And with that, I want to thank Acting Commissioner Werfel for being here today. And we're going to continue to monitor the IRS and its treatment of small businesses. And I would also like I appreciate the fact that you put Ferris Fink in charge, or at least being our point person and being a part of this review process that you're talking about. He's obviously the Commissioner of Small Business and Self-Employed Division, and we want to be interacting with him. In addition, we're also going to have some questions. There'll be committee members on both sides of the aisle that'll have questions, and I want you to commit to respond to those in a timely manner and as quickly as possible, as fully as possible. But with that, I would ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Without objection, that is so ordered, and with that, the hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.